This episode was plagued with a lot of technical issues with fraps. I kept getting weird FPS crashes. It's starting to act kind of cranky on me, but it missed the most impressive part of this landing, was the litho braking, which destroyed a landing strut, made the engine explode, and yet bounced me back into space with a slow enough velocity that I was able to bring it back down safely. I misread the mission specs on this. I was actually supposed to return this probe, and I hadn't figured that out quite yet because I was so intent on getting it landed. But just did the quick science experiments, realized my mistake later, and then transmitted everything back. I was really disappointed that the almost disastrous landing got lost, but things being what they were, I was glad I got at least something. And all my technical issues being what they were, I actually lost a bunch of footage from this latest stretch of playing. There's a lot of experiments and flights that would not cooperate at all with fraps running. So my science progress, there's a couple unlocks that aren't shown, and the numbers aren't going to add up if anyone's deciding for some reason to follow around on paper. I'm hoping that some adjustments I've made to my processor clock speed are going to make things a little more stable. I was running a 4.8 gigahertz overclock. I've backed it back down to 4.6, which is just enough to keep my modded Skyrim save from CPU bottlenecking. So we'll see how much more stable it runs. So far it's seemed a lot happier than it had been. But yeah, right here I unlock advanced, or I think it's advanced construction, but it won't actually show me unlock fueling systems. Unfortunately, I ended up spending an awful lot more on that satellite network than I was planning on, and the reading comprehension failure on my part for that lunar landing mission has put me perilously close to running out of money. So this is just a quick science probe launched into the upper atmosphere to gather both a little bit of science and a healthy stack of cash. It's not going to be anything too extreme, but it was definitely built with cost effectiveness in mind. It'll easily hit that altitude goal. One of the benefits of that satellite network is, since they all have the omnidirectional arrays on them, that I really don't have to worry about running any low carbon orbit missions out of their range and having probes shut down. As long as I have the dipole antenna, I should stay well within range of the network. Getting ready to ditch my fairing. Reorganize some staging here. At this point, the fairing's not making much of an aerodynamic difference, but anything's better than nothing. Fire those. Fire this. And yes, the uncanny resemblance to Sputnik was intentional. Carrying pretty much the same sensor package as Sputnik 1, which was a thermometer and a radio transmitter. Although interestingly enough, I think Sputnik 1 actually had a radio repeater on board, if what I read recently was correct, and it was in effect, though not in intent, the first communication satellite. It had the ability to propagate a radio signal sent to it to other locations. And they're definitely asking more of this mission than Sputnik 1, the real one, in that they want you to recover the probe intact. So I should probably take this as an opportunity to retract these before they burn off on re-entry. Just hoping I didn't get my center of mass completely messed up. Really don't want this tumbling on re-entry. Which I can't tell if it's trying to center or what it's doing here. All I need to do is absorb that heat. Getting a little bit of heating. Start deploying that parachute. That very nearly ended unpleasantly. And all deadly reentry heat shields do have decouplers built into them, but I've been keeping them attached to most of my probes, just simply because they have a higher impact tolerance than the science package that they're usually cushioning. Once this parachute pops, and time accelerate down. Very slow descent. Going to unlock, dang it. Specialized control. Here I am returning a lunar lander probe that I designed to come back, the latest in my boring unmanned exploration vehicles. Launching yet another mapping satellite, only this one's going to do a multispectral scan, which collects biome data. And I'm actually being smart about this one and using a mission that'll give me a little bit of payout for putting this one up. And this will have a side benefit of acting as a polar orbit communication satellite. And finishing up the scan. Analyze the data, transmit it back home. with all that unmanned local exploration finally out of the way, we are underway and in the process of developing our Apollo program analog. If you look at the equipment stack just behind the decoupler under the pod, that is the universal storage mod that allows you to build different service modules for your ships. They have fuel cells, atmospheric reprocessors. I've had to do some modding to get it, some tweaking of my own to get it TAC life support compatible, because in default it's not. I'm still not entirely happy. The resource consumption on the fuel cell is way too high for the amount of oxygen and hydrogen you can carry using TAC life support densities, and I didn't want to break TAC life support because I can always just quit using the universal storage mod. It's mainly a looks cool, neat functionality thing. It's not really necessary. But now that I have finally unlocked the 3-man pods and I can start doing some more interesting manned missions, we've got as our first mission control extended mission to do, I've got a proving flight for a 3-man orbiter. I've made a knockoff Apollo orbiter, and the goal is to kick this thing into orbit and have it stay up there for at least 2 hours, I believe, is the time on the recording. But I don't have anything powerful enough to really lift it as high as they were asking me to. All I've got is the skipper. I don't have the mainsail unlocked yet. So I had to go with this clustered arrangement of one LVT-45 in the middle for vectoring and a couple LVT-30s around for thrust. They're actually quite efficient in this configuration, but they don't have a lot of thrust to weight. And in fact, when I launched this one, it drifted sideways probably by about 30 to 40 feet before it finally started gaining much in the way of vertical velocity. Pretty easy to fly. Once it gets moving, it's got nice steady acceleration for the rest of the trip. I just thought it was a little ridiculous, the altitude they ask you to go for right off the bat, but there's a couple balance issues with Mission Control Extended that I think could stand to be ironed out. Overall, I'm very happy using it, but what, like missions where you have to land on other planets with an unmanned probe, they make you get into a stable orbit before you descend, and I'm much more of a hit periaps and go directly into my descent phase if I can. Or especially the ones where you crash into the moons. I just set my periaps to 0 and slam it into the surface. That I used to play with the Interstellar mod on my own private save, but to get all these things working without having to go to extreme texture compression, I decided to leave Interstellar out. But one of the experiment changes they made in that mod that I really like, and why Mooner impactors are even an issue for me, is they reprogrammed the accelerometer to act as a seismic sensor. You can plant it on any planet or body, not asteroids, but tell it to record data. And if you slam something into the surface of the planet, and that means the surface of the planet, you can't crash it into the runway or the launch pad at KSC because those are actual models and not the ground. It'll record the impact and let you send science back. Normally, I got so used to using those, it became a real big part of my Apollo programs on my own private save, because one of the main experiments the Apollo program performed was they would put seismic sensors on the planet and have the transfer stages of later missions slam into the moon at high velocity, and that would it would send a vibration through the moon, ringing it kind of like a bell, and from that seismic data they were able to find out a lot about the internal structure of the moon. And it's really neat for a nerd like me to be able to reproduce that in the game, but I had to make a decision, and going into warp speed and far future flights is really beyond the scope of what I'm wanting to do in this series. So as much as I did love that experiment, I just left the mod uninstalled for this. But I've got the Apollo style service module engine. I believe that's a KW rocketry part, and unfortunately my genius self launched this at night. I've really gotten impatient with the slow progress in the beginning, and that's my own fault. I'm using mods that they're not specifically designed to, but all of them together drastically slow down the progress you can make in the early game. Mission Control Extended, you can't just slap a bunch of parts together and go straight to the moon on your first launch. My remote tech with the community hotfix means I have to have a comm link for every mission I send out, so I'm really limited to Kerbin SOI until I get a bigger transmitter unlocked. And the biggest transmitters I have only have a 90 megameter range, and that's just enough to get barely out of Kerbin's SOI, which, going back, I just remembered that where some of my science that wasn't recorded came from was I launched a mission that was a lot like the Explorer 1 probe that went outside of, that was just launched away from Earth. I think it was Explorer 1, I can't remember the exact one. But it was the first deep space probe we ever launched, and the 90 megameter dish had just enough range that I could get some science transmitted back from just outside Kerbin's SOI. But I just don't have anything that'll reach out to Duna yet, which I really want to unlock soon, because the first flyby of Mars actually happened before the Apollo program got fully underway. I think it was 1962 was the first Martian flyby, and I don't think Apollo really got running until 1963. And if anyone's wondering the reason why I didn't do a Gemini analog series of missions was because in Mission Control Extended, the closest thing they have to Gemini is launching an unmanned. You launch a single Kerbal pod with a probe core attached and a Clampetron Junior. I don't know why that is in the early missions list, because on a stock tech tree you don't get the Clampetron Junior until much, much later. So I just kind of skipped over Gemini. The assumption is, yeah, it happened, because otherwise I would be launching basically the biggest part of the Gemini program was learning to do EVAs and maneuvering and rendezvous in space. So basically we'd just be spending money to send two pods up in orbit next to one another, which there's no science points to be gained from that, and I really need to get this science intake ramped up, because as I've mentioned many times before, this is starting to get very tedious. And finally getting my Apollo type modules on the way to being unlocked, I can finally do a Mooner flyby or a flyby of Minmus, which I've got enough cash reserves on hand at this stage that I really don't care too much about following the mission profile to the letter. But here I am coming up on my 2-hour mark for the orbit. But I think that's a rather attractive looking spacecraft right there. The half-stack RCS tank you see there is from the KSPX mod, which, if I remember correctly, the author of that mod was actually hired by Squad to do some models, and her cupola module became the cupola module that released in .22, I think was what it came out in. But in this one, it's a 3-person pod with just the basic interior. I do have some uses for it. I've used it in some large transfer ships. Excuse me. And some Duna lander and ascent vehicles. But that's all in the future. Speaking of mods that slow me down, TAC life support also prevents me from just pitching the single-man pod out to like a Mars flyby, or Duna flyby. So, but this is the last flight of this video. We're returning the Kerpolo module after its inaugural test flight. And it's about this time that I noticed electrical charge didn't transfer from the service module to the command module. So I'm actually coming in on dead batteries, and your Kerbals, I think you get about 2 hours. It took my oxygen, no, my electric charge is fine, but it took my oxygen to power the fuel cells. And I have, I think, about 3 minutes to get these guys on the ground before they all suffocate. So I was sweating bullets here and time accelerating, trying to get them down. But once you get below a certain altitude, I'm assuming I guess it assumes you've got a atmospheric equalization valve. But got everybody home safely and brought home the bacon.